Now the whole idea behind a faux finish is to create a painted surface that looks like something other than paint. And we do that by starting with a base coat on a wall and then covering that with one or several coats of glaze that you mix yourself, and then texture with things like sponges or rags or feathers or whatever your imagination can come up with.
Well, let's talk about glaze first, because that's where most people get confused. Now, the main element is a glazing liquid, which you can now get in most paint stores or home centers. Now, this is a latex, but alkyds are also available. A glaze is basically paint without any color in it, so it's usually milky or clear. But you add regular colored paint to it to create a glaze that's used over the base coat as a top coat in most faux finishes.
I might wonder, why not just use paint? Well, you could do that, but with most faux finishes, you want to be able to see through the glaze or the top coat through to the base coat. Now, paint's just plain going to be too thick, but when you mix a paint with the glaze, that gives it just enough translucency so you see through that glaze onto the base coat. Now, it varies with the finish, but the recommended formulas are usually about 4 parts glazing liquid to 1 part paint, but you don't have to be that exact. Now, for a normal sized room, that's about 1 gallon of glazing liquid and 1 quart of paint. Now, the color value should stay about the same, but again, the glazing liquid makes it more translucent for faux finishes. Now, it still has paint's consistency, so it's not going to get all runny on the walls, which is what happens if you try to just thin out the paint by using water.
Well, one critical aspect to applying a faux finish is to get it looking right before the paint dries. And that can be a problem for some beginners, especially when using latex paints, which can dry quickly. Some glazing liquids extend the dry time, but you can also add a latex conditioner just to cover yourself. And this was formulated to smooth out the paint flow in sprayers, but it also extends the dry time without affecting the color or the sheen. If you've got a 4-to-1 glaze mix like this, you can add up to 1 part conditioner. You can also add it to regular paint alone, add a ratio of 1 part conditioner to 3 parts paint, and use that as a top coat for a faux finish. But it doesn't have the translucent quality of glazing liquid, so the result is less subtle and more like using regular paint.
Whichever way you go, it can get to be a lot of different formulas to remember. So really your best bet is to just mix up a small batch and then test it out a little bit. Now, what we're using is a small piece of poster board, and we've painted the base coat on it. Now, it's also a good place to practice your faux finishing techniques to make sure you know what you're doing before you hit the wall. So have a few of these on hand before you start. Now, the paints that work best for faux finishing are paints with a little bit of gloss, eggshell or semi-gloss. And that goes for the top coat as well as the base coat. Flat paints don't work nearly as well. They tend to dry too fast, plus they absorb way too much of the glaze. So how's that looking?
Pretty good. As for color, most people recommend that beginners do not try to combine high contrast colors like blue and yellow because they're really hard to blend. Stick with one color family, like on this color chip here. You can use one of the lighter colors for the base coat and then try one of these darker colors for the glaze, or vice versa. Well, now that you're up to speed on the materials, the next step is to show you some of the most basic faux finishing techniques.
Now, one of the most popular faux finishing techniques is sponging. Now, to do this, I'm using a natural sea sponge. I'm just kind of dabbing it around like this. Now, you can get these sea sponges at craft stores, paint stores, as well as home centers. And I wouldn't recommend using the colored cellulose sponges. They give you way too much of a uniform pattern. Whereas natural sea sponge like this has a real random pattern. And by twisting and turning that sponge as you go, it helps to make that pattern even more random. Now, it's nice to have a sea sponge with real soft edges like this. We don't want a real uniform pattern.
Well, what works best with the glaze is to pour it into a flat pan or a tray so you can easily access it with your texturing tool. There we go. I got a little piece of sponge here. Dean will explain this in a minute. But with sponging, what works best is to load up one end of the sponge, like so with the paint, and then don't go directly to the wall. Offload some of that paint onto the tray or a piece of cardboard or something so it doesn't run once it hits the wall.
I'm just dabbing the sponge around randomly, changing directions on the sponge as I go. Now, you want to keep kind of a random effect going. You don't want to fill in the area too uniformly. So you can see I have some lighter spots, but then some darker areas that I'm concentrating on, and just keep coming back and going over it, working way into the corner. Now, one thing I want to do is once I have an area about the way I would like to see it, then I want to keep a wet edge moving. So I'll just continue down the wall along the bottom here. Okay, move the ladder.
As you progress, step back and take a look at the overall effect, especially when working with a partner. You want everything to be balanced, not too light, not too dark, and you don't want to see any patterns emerging. With sponging, it can be a little bit tough on beginners. They might space the sponging too far apart, or they forget to twist their wrists, and then you see a pattern forming, kind of like a block print.
Now, one thing that do-it-yourselfers have a problem with many times, and that is getting into the corner. If they use a large sponge, they have a tendency to press it too hard, which releases too much paint, so it doesn't look like the rest of the wall. So what works real well is to find a sponge with a fairly straight edge, cut it into little pieces, then load this up with paint, and just work that in the corner every now and again. That gives it a real nice even look. Another thing I've done too is taped up the side here, so I don't have to worry about getting any paint on this wall. So I'd have to keep on moving. You want to leave a few open areas. Okay.
Well, that gives you the basic idea of sponging. On one of our past projects, Dean and I did a similar sponging finish, but with two colors over the base coat, not just one. So take a look at how we handled that job.
Are you done with that one? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, the sponge painting technique isn't quite as easy as it looks. Most people think you get a sea sponge, dab some paint on it, start working over your wall here, and you just automatically end up with something that looks gorgeous. Well, it isn't quite that easy. And what's interesting is it's this technique that has just about become the generic term for faux finishing, when really this is just one of the applications.
Now, actually, the faux finishing experts that we worked with say that when you're using a sponge, it's really hard to get consistent results. That's because if there's a golden rule in this business, it's to disguise your tool. And you don't want to make it too obvious how you created the effect. And with a sponge, it's real difficult because the look is so distinctive. So the best procedure for using the sponge technique is to start out with a very light base coat. Now, we used an off-white latex with an eggshell sheen. And now we're putting two different colors on top of that.
Okay, I'm going to start with the darkest color, and you want to use the flat, large part of the sponge. You start dabbing it on the wall, and you want to vary your pattern. And we use a technique that we call opening and closing the door. You kind of rotate it as you're placing it on the wall. You see I'm doing here. Now, one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to bounce all over the wall. It's much more hard to get a consistent pattern. It works a lot better if you just come down the wall in this fashion, like so. And when you get down to the trim, make certain that you're getting the pattern right up against the edge there so it doesn't look disjointed from the rest of your pattern. See how that looks? Now I'll move on to the gray color, which is slightly lighter. Now here's how you get paint on the sponge. You dip it very gently into the paint. You get just a little bit on the bottom of the sponge. Then you want to offload it. It does a couple of things. One is it evens out the paint on the bottom of the sponge, but it also gets it so you don't have great big globs of paint that will smear all over the wall. And then go up here and, like with the burgundy color, I just start opening and closing the door again, moving that pattern around on top of the burgundy. Doing it fairly softly so I don't offload too much paint onto the wall. Just keep working that around the area, right down against the trim.
Well, I'm working with the third color now, which is the lightest, and it's also the same color as the base. Now, in other words, so far, I've worked from the darkest color on the bottom to the lightest color on top. And again, it's just random movements. I'm not trying to cover anything, I'm just adding another layer to the texture. Okay, and every once in a while you need to just step back and reassess the whole picture. What do you think?
Well, I think we're still a little bit light right in this area right there.
Okay, a little less intense than over there. What if I put some more burgundy there?
Okay, yeah, just a little bit more texture, and I think we'll be in good shape. Well, once you get all three colors down the first time, then you start layering a little bit. And here, you're just trying to get everything real consistent. Just trying to create a certain type of look. I'll tell you one thing you probably don't want to do is do it exactly the way we just showed you. And what I mean by that is everybody does something just slightly differently. And so you don't want, let's say, Robin putting down the red up to this point and then me putting down the rest of it. Instead, what works a lot better is possibly have one person do the dark color all the way around the room, the other person come back and do the gray color. You're maintaining a consistent pattern all the way around. It's going to look a whole lot better. I mean, it's tough enough for one person to try to accomplish what they did here exactly the same way on the other side of the room.
Is it looking better?
There's a couple of these really dark ones. Okay, looks pretty good. That should give you the basic idea of how sponging works. Now for our next technique, we're going to work on the opposite wall. You might wonder, why don't we work on one of the adjacent spaces? Well, the idea is while we're working on the wall over there, this will dry. When we're done over there, we can come back, move the masking from this wall over to here, and then work on the adjacent spaces.
Now, along with sponging, it's one of the most common faux finishing techniques. You might have heard people refer to this as rag rolling, and you can see where they get that term because you basically twist the rag into a tube-like shape and then roll it onto the wall to create the technique that you want here, the texture. There we go. And what I'm doing right now is known as ragging on. What I do first is dip the rag into the glaze, and then I want to offload it a little bit here because I want to distribute that paint around the rag as much as possible. Just squish it a little bit there, and I want to make sure that there isn't any drips of paint on my gloves so it kind of messes up the wall. Okay, then I just go back to rolling. Now, this is a positive technique since I'm applying the glaze directly to the wall, similar to what Dean did with the sponge. Now, the main principle is the same. You want to work in small areas, keep a wet edge, and change direction to avoid patterns.
Okay, now we're going to show you another variation on the ragging technique. This is called ragging off. Now this is what they call a negative technique. And what they mean by that is, first of all, you cover the entire wall with the glaze, which is what I'm doing here. You can do that with either a roller or a brush. And once that's covered, then you take the rag and actually start removing the glaze. That's what they call negative. Just like this, kind of roll it down. And kind of the main difference between this and the positive technique is you'll end up leaving more glaze on the wall this way. So this variation will be a little bit darker. Probably your best bet is to do a couple sample boards, see what you like the best. And if you like the negative technique the best, probably you should sample with different types of claws to see what you like better, because each different type of material will give you a different texture.
A couple of years ago, we tried a variation of the ragging off technique to produce a parchment effect. We first rolled our glaze out over the base coat. Then, instead of a rag roll, we wadded up some 90-weight cheesecloth and used that to spread the glaze out and remove any excess. Again, you don't want the technique to be too obvious, so we used a dabbing motion and twisted our wrists between dabs to keep from creating patterns. Now, on a long wall like that, you have to move pretty fast, though, to maintain a wet edge and avoid lap marks. But these highlights should give you a sense of how the cheesecloth works with a negative technique. For another type of parchment finish, we worked with painters Tom Fernoffel and Steve Segrist on our Shingle Cottage project. They used a rag roll technique, so you can see how that looks on the wall. It's always interesting to see how the pros do it, and Dean had a few questions as they worked their way up the main staircase.
Now, how do you guys sync up so that you end up with the same look? So that you don't have different parts of the walls looking, oh, there, that's part Tom did. Or
That is sort of the trick. I mean, we've been working together a long time now. One thing we have to make sure is we have the same type of rag, and it has to be the same size, and we continually check one another, make sure that we have the same consistency of paint on the rag as well.
Yeah.
And then we'll go back and forth over each other's work as well to look at it and make sure that there's an even coat, an even skin on everything.
Why don't you go ahead and show us the technique there.
Okay. I like to keep the rag nice and loose, so I continually model it around.
And it isn't real wet either, it doesn't look like.
It's not. It's not. I wring it out real well and make sure that I'm not applying too much.
You keep flipping it around, it looks like.
That's so it does not make a pattern like a block print.
Yeah.
If you continually use the same creases on the rag, it will form a pattern. And I try to keep it very random. If I go in a grid, again, you will see it would look like a pattern or wallpaper, this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
This because it is done by hand, it has that unique quality.
Now, will you use that rag all day long?
You can use this rag on the entire house.
Okay.
Yeah, you can use this rag on the entire house, and you can also keep this rag in your glaze and use it for later touch-ups.
Which is key, because you'll want to save this exact mixture so down the road if there's a crack in the plaster or something, you can fix it, put the base coat over it, and then touch back up again.
Exactly. What I like to do if there's a crack is patch it with a paintable latex caulk, so it continually stays flexible, and reapply the base coat in that area, and take that same rag out of the glaze can that I've had in the closet, and just reapply it the same way. So for years you can do that.
Technique I like to do is just don't patch them until they get to be about a 1/4 inch wide.
Exactly.
You really notice them.
Dust them out a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'll just kind of sit back and watch you a little bit here.
In a high traffic area like this, the faux finish is susceptible to damage and dirt, so you might think about covering it with an acrylic or latex clear coat. That'll protect the finish and make it easier to wash up.
Okay, well, we're just about done with the ragging demonstration, but again, let's talk a little bit about the edges and corners, because that's where you can really screw up a little bit. What works best in a situation like this is to take a small piece of the exact same cloth, get into a fairly tight roll, and then use that to go up against the corners and the edges. It's just going to give you a little bit nicer look than trying to take that big rag and do the same thing.
Now there's another basic faux finishing technique that's pretty easy for the do-it-yourselfer. It's called color washing, and it boils down to blending 2 glaze coats over the base coat to create kind of an antique stained look on the wall. And Dean's putting the first glaze coat on. For this you want it to be a little runny. So I'm adding some water to the basic 4-to-1 glazing liquid and paint mix. How much water you add really depends on the look that you're going for. Some people say 50-50, some say a lot more than that. Again, you really want to try it out on a sample board first.
Now there's quite a few ways to apply a color wash. Now, what I'm doing is applying the first coat with a roller, and I'm taking a sponge and I'm just kind of taking off a little bit of this. I just don't want to keep it quite as intense as color as the roller has it there. Okay, that's probably a pretty good starting point right there. And then once I have that first color taken care of, I'll come in with the second color and start spreading that around a little bit. And again, we just want to keep a real random look going. In the process of this, I'm pulling off some of the glaze from the first layer, but also applying a little bit of the white. I think I'll go with just a little bit more white color. Again, this is totally up to what you feel is the look you're going for. All right, and then once the glaze is at about a point where you feel you want it, then it's time to apply the texture, because we haven't done the texture yet. We've just got the glaze on. To apply the texture, we're going to use a couple of different types of brushes. Now this is a fairly stiff bristle brush, and here we just want to start running across the paint like this. We want to go in a few different directions to keep that kind of random looking, to give it that antique patina sort of look. Now what we found looks the best is this little bit softer brush. See, it just really mutes the colors much more than the bristle brush. So, and again, we don't want everything running in one direction, so we'll kind of mix it up a little bit as we go. You see, this really kind of blends all the colors together. Now this is still not a totally subtle effect. If you want to go a little bit more subtle, we would just pull some more of this color again off so you'd see the base a little bit more. On one of our past projects, we were lucky enough to be involved with the redecorating of an old Irish cottage along the River Lee in County Cork, Ireland. And that was the perfect spot for several faux finishes created by painter Billy Newman, including a variation on the color wash idea in the living room. Okay, so kind of fill us in on what you're doing. We have our base coat down already, and so this is, what exactly is the wash?
This is an acrylic emulsion.
Emulsion being
Emulsion
what?
being a wall paint that we use here in Ireland.
Okay, and it looks like you've thinned this down pretty well.
Considerably to get the effect that we need, which is an old, stained effect.
Okay, so what you're going for here is a wall that looks like it's been here for many, many years and probably somewhat neglected. And
A lot of years and a lot neglected.
okay, all right. Well, it's starting to look like that. When you do this in people's homes, do you typically like to have the people on site so they can maybe direct you a little bit on how much they want to leave behind or how much they want to take off?
Yeah, I do really. That way you don't get into a lot of trouble.
You have more satisfied customers. Or let's put it this way, the customer has nobody to blame but themselves, right?
Yeah, that sounds better.
Here's what the room looked like after Billy was all done, and all the decorative elements had been added. Okay, that should do it. Well, that gives you an idea of what a wash looks like. This is what you want it to look like. But I have to say, this is not what you want it to look like. Now, let me explain to you the mistake that I made here. I wanted to go back and just touch this up a little bit, so I took my darker sponge, applied it to the top, just added some on. What happened is that glaze ate through the glaze that had already dried on the wall. When I went back to brush it, it just removed that top part of the glaze, and so we end up with that, which is not the most attractive effect. Your best bet is to start in a corner and just keep continuous wet edge as you move across the wall, and then stop at another edge or corner or wherever. Now, I just did this for demonstration, but you would never want to start in the center like this. To continue from this point would be very difficult. This is a dry edge. When you apply something up here, you're really going to know that there's a difference between where you started and where you continued. So at any rate, a wash over there, which really contrasts quite sharply to what we did on the first wall, which was a positive effect, a sponge finish.
And then the two rag finishes over here. Now, even though it's a little tricky, I think that with some practice, most people would be able to master any of these techniques. But this is just a fraction of what faux finishers can do nowadays. So we thought it'd be interesting to get a couple of pros to show us some of the tricks of the trade. And that's what we'll be covering next.
Now, the first thing we're going to do are a couple different sponge techniques. What's the first one?
The first one we'll do is a sponge on, sponge off application.
Okay, why don't you just go ahead and describe the technique.
Okay. You want to take a nice, soft, natural sea sponge that you've moistened and wring out really good. Load it with your glaze. We're going to take it to the wall and apply it in kind of a wiping motion. We just want to get our glaze to the wall.
All right.
Okay?
You're not doing the dabbing.
No, you don't want to dab it on and create a pattern. We just want to get our glaze on so we can create our pattern with the next technique, and that'll be the negative application.
Okay, could you also roll this on?
This is something you could roll on.
You could.
Yes, you could, because you're going to create your pattern. And what I've done here is I've taken the same sponge and I've just moistened it, started out with a nice clean one that's been wrung out really well. And I'm going to take it to the glaze that I've just applied.
Okay.
And I'm going to blot it off and create a really nice mottled effect.
Now, how much of that do you want to take off?
It's all up to you, the look you desire. We can do it like this, and if I decide I want to remove more, I can wet my sponge and come in again and start taking a little more off.
Are there any special techniques for getting the right up against the edge of the wall or up in the corners?
Yes, you want to make sure you take that sponge with your glaze and push it right on into the corner. Make sure you get it all the way in a nice even edge. You don't want to see any stopping point. You want to make this whole wall flow.
And you hit it again with that.
And then you take your negative sponge in just the same and start blotting it out the same way.
Yep.
Just taking it in and out. And
to get a real nice blend right into the
right.
color.
Blend it really nicely. You want to keep it real uniform. That's going to create a nice professional finish for you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to check see how Kelly's doing.
Alrighty.
Now, Kelly's going to be doing another sponge technique called what, a sponge slide, is it?
Yeah, we're going to do a sponge slide, and what we're going to do here is I'm going to load my sponge up into a deep colored glaze, and I'm going to download on my excess paint onto the surface here of just a piece of cardboard. I'm going to come into my wall, and I'm just going to slightly touch the sponge to the surface of the wall, and I'm just kind of giving it just a little bit of a wiggle, and I'm just softly touching it. I'm going to keep working back over the surface, just filling in as I go. And my goal is to get about a 70 to 80% coverage on the surface.
Of this one color?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can see how I'm just softly touching the wall. I'm not trying to cover it like in the previous technique.
And this is called a positive technique because you're applying paint to the wall. You're not putting paint on and then pulling it off again.
Exactly.
Okay.
We're just simply putting it on, and we're going to let this go. We could let this one dry and work the whole room if we wanted, or then come in and do a second color later. But what I'm going to do right now I've got about 80% coverage on my wall, so I'm going to go ahead and get a second color.
Okay.
A cream color. I'm going to dip my sponge into the glaze again, and I'm also going to download the excess off onto my board. I'm going to come in and do the same thing. And the purpose of this one now is we're just going to kind of melt these colors together. You can just start seeing it melt and pull the colors together. And when you're doing this, actually there is a little more technique to it because you want to get a little more uniform. But with this finish, also as you can see right now we're running out. I'm going to just load another.
This would be a difficult one for me to jump in and do the area of the wall right next to you. I think there'd be a real pattern difference.
Yeah, if you get two sponges in there, you're going to have two different hands because every sponge is different and everybody's touch is different. So the key would be to have one person do one color. As you go in, you start to see this does melt together really well. And putting the second color over glaze really takes away any flaws that you might have because you're doing two process.
Yeah. Now, do you usually use the darker color underneath and then the brighter color on top?
As a rule, you want to start with your deeper colors because they can become dominant, and you want to bury those unless you're trying to achieve a deep colored overglaze.
Yeah. Boy, that's looking great. Now, again, one of the things that's real important with this is maintaining the wet edge as you move along. I have to believe that's something you teach at the school, right?
Yes, it's a very important issue in any faux finish. You don't want ever see overlap lines.
Okay.
I think one key important fact here is that we keep this 6-inch wet edge here that Carrie's got, and as Carrie's doing her negative sponging, I'm coming in here keeping this wet edge where I'm slid, and she's working this area, keeping it fresh.
And you don't want to keep a real straight line is what you're saying.
No, you want to work it kind of in bellies like this. That way you don't get a straight line up and down the wall if you do get any drier marks.
Okay.
And then I'll just keep working this and keeping it wet until Carrie catches up to me if you're working in teams. And then when she reaches the point where she's caught up, then I'll start working further over my wall.
And for a technique like this to kind of keep moving things along, it probably does work pretty well to work in teams, kind of like we were doing before. But this one over here is a little bit more of a one-man band, I would have to think.
Yeah, with this particular finish, it is best to have one person do the finish so that they have the same hand and the same look throughout the whole wall.
Yeah, okay. Well, this gives you a couple of different options for sponge finishes. Again, this is a negative application where you apply the paint and then pull it back off again. This is positive, where what you apply to the wall is what you end up getting. I suppose we should probably get these pulled off here before they dry too much so we can do something else again. Start taking this one. Well, now we've moved on to something that you probably wouldn't even think of as a faux finish. This is it's a very structured look. In fact, this is supposed to look more like wallpaper. Now what we've done is we've put tape on the walls here to make it look like stripes. So we have our matte wall finish on the background. Then Kelly is applying high gloss clear coat over the top. Net. That's what, an acrylic?
Yeah, this is a waterborne urethane, which can come in either a gloss or a low luster. In this case, we are applying a high gloss.
And by putting this over the top, it really gives it a subtle look. Where do you typically use an application like this?
We use this application quite a bit in master bedrooms and bathrooms or occasional rooms, formal living room, dining room type situations.
Now, if you wanted to, you could go with contrasting colors. I mean, you could go with something as bright as white and black stripes, right?
You could, yeah, absolutely. You could create any color stripe effect that you want. The type we're doing right now is more of a tone-on-tone, more of a formal type of application.
Now, one thing I should point out is you want to get this tape off before that clear coat dries. Okay, that should be pretty good. Well, we have another base coat on this wall, so we're ready to show you a few more full finishing techniques. Now, the next thing we're going to be doing is a lot more textured in nature. What we're doing is adding some vertical lines to this wall to somewhat mimic linen or like a grass cloth. They call it, what, strié or combing? What are some other things that they might call that?
Dragging is a term we also use.
Okay, is that folded about right?
That looks great.
So we're going to be using different tools and then dragging those over the glaze to create that vertical effect.
Right. This is a terry cloth towel that's been folded tightly in a nice wad so your hands can be fitted on there and get a good grip. I'm going to take this and dip it into the glaze mixture. Just the tips of it, just to get enough on there to have some coloration on it so you don't pull the glaze off too strongly in one area.
Sure.
And you go up to the corner, and you want to get as nice and tightly to that ceiling as you can. And tuck it in, apply even pressure on your rag with your fingertips, and simply start dragging and pulling that glaze down with the towel.
I notice you're not using a stepladder for this.
Right. We've used some boxes, or you can use a bucket, simply because you can't step off of a stepladder very easily and you would lose your pattern.
You have to keep this going very evenly, it would seem, or you're going to create a real bizarre looking pattern.
Right. You don't have to keep it perfectly straight. The straighter the better, but if it waves a little, it's not a problem.
Should I give it a shot
Why don't
here?
you give it a try, Dean?
Okay. All right, so again, even pressure, start at the top. Do you overlap your other area?
Yeah, you can run right into what you've just done.
Whoa!
Yeah,
How's
but
that for a little crooked, huh?
Looks fine. See, it looks just fine. And by keeping your elbows somewhat in, you can help control the straightness.
Okay, right over the top of the
Right over the top of that, and straight down into the
Straight down.
floorboard. Yep.
Over the base.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it looks good. And then you just keep going in that direction.
Tuck it up in the
Push.
top. You know, the hard part's stepping off the boxes. There we go, that's a little bit straighter.
And you can see the starting part is a little difficult to get a perfect edge at the ceiling, so this might be a technique that's good to apply a border at the ceiling line.
Okay. Try one more here, then I'll probably have to clean off the cloth a little bit, it looks like.
Yeah, it's starting to accumulate up there.
It's getting pretty gloppy looking. So what's the next step then once you get too much on this thing?
When it starts to do that for you, you might want to rinse it out and start over, or simply take your towel and fold it another way and dip it in the glaze again
Dip the
and
edge
just
again.
start all over. If this turns out a little heavy in areas and it's not as consistent as you like, you can go back and drag through it all again, removing as much glaze as you like to create whatever look you desire.
Okay.
But the fun of this pattern is that it doesn't have to be perfect. This is a nice look.
It can vary a little bit.
It can vary, and that adds a lot of character that way too.
All right, well, I'm going to check see what Kelly's up to.
Alrighty.
Now, it looks like you're just putting on the last bit of glaze here. What type of roller are you using to accomplish that?
Well, this roller is a foam roller. You can get it at any paint store, and what it does is it applies the glaze a lot smoother and a lot more even so that you don't have thick and light areas on your wall.
Okay.
And the glaze mixture that we're using on the wall, again, in all the finishes is the same. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 parts glazing liquid to 1 part paint.
Okay. Now, Kelly's going to show a few different tools for applying, again, a different type of effect. Why don't we start with your patented squeegee?
Okay.
This is kind of an interesting thing. Now, you bought a regular squeegee, notched out the edges.
Yep, I just took a razor blade and just cut the edges out. real random pattern so that you don't have to worry about making it even, and it makes an interesting finish.
And again, you start right up in the corner on something like this?
What we'll do here is I'll go ahead and start, and we're just gonna pull down nice and easily.
Do you end up creating quite a line of paint as you're coming down the wall?
Yeah, and so we're getting a little bit heavy here. We might want to
Put the drop cloth down there.
rag. So we'll just take a rag
Interesting.
here.
So really, you could basically just cut in whatever type of pattern you'd like to see on
Yeah, any pattern
that
would
type
work.
of squeegee.
And you can see the wider and the skinnier marks in there,
Yep.
and it just gives you a nice overall finish.
Okay. Next on the docket, steel wool. Now that's an interesting one. I don't think anybody would ever think about using that.
Now this is a coarse grit steel wool or a heavy yacht steel wool that you can get in any store. You can get some bigger pads, which would probably work better for doing your walls. But what this is going to do is just going to give us a heavy, coarse feel. I'm going to just step over just a little bit here, and it'll give us more of a broken strié effect.
Interesting. That does look more like grass cloth.
Yeah, this gives you a really nice grass cloth effect.
Uh-huh.
Come back up here. And just start back over, and it doesn't hurt to overlap your finish a little bit. But instead of a nice perfect line, you get this broken random effect with the steel wool.
I suppose the bigger the pad, the easier it would be. You're not moving
Absolutely.
use a little Brillo pad, take it forever.
It helps to stand again like on a box or a bucket, so that as you're coming down, I notice I start to bend my elbows and step off and pull. You can do this on an 8-foot wall, but anything bigger than that, it's probably going to be a little tough.
I mean, that is the trick to keep this thing nice and smooth and even as you come down the wall.
Absolutely.
That's the hard part.
And again, with this finish, you're going to have a little bit of wobble in there, but that's fine because the grass cloth isn't going to be perfect either.
Definitely leaves a lot more paint on, or a lot more glaze on the wall than
Absolutely.
the squeegee.
Absolutely.
Now the other one is you're back to the sponge again.
Yep. We're going to just take here a sponge, a natural sea sponge that's been damped with water, dampened with water, and wrung out really good. And we're going to do, this is going to leave a similar effect like the strié we did earlier. And we're going to just start at the top. Again, we're going to have a start and stopping point. We're going to want to use a border up here, but we'll just pull the sponge down through our finish. That'll leave a little bit of a softer finish.
Oh, sure, yeah. So there you're taking off the majority of the glaze again.
Yes.
Just totally different looks. Working on that border, is that kind of tricky for do-it-yourselfers?
Not necessarily. Just you got to keep in mind that you're going to get that stopping point and starting point at the top of the wall, and you may want to. You could also just tape it off if you wanted to and paint your own border.
All right.
So very simple to do.
Very nice.
And that's it.
Yeah. So three very different looks, but again, it's that same type of strié approach.
Absolutely. This one you get a more of a coarse straight line. This one again you get the broken strié grass cloth effect, and this one's going to look more like a hand painted strié wallpaper.
Now with this technique, we're going to be using plastic. It looks like the base is pretty well all set, right?
Right, got the glaze rolled on.
Okay. And we're using the same glaze we did before.
Yes, 4-to-1.
4-to-1 mixture. Okay. And the plastic we're using, does it make a difference what type?
It matters somewhat. You can use any type, but you can create different effects by the different types of plastic that you'll use.
This has to be, what, about a 1 mil? Looks
Yeah,
like
that sounds
fairly-
about right. And what you want to do is get that plastic pushed onto the wall, and by using your fingertips, kind of maneuver the folds in the plastic.
But without making it look like finger paints underneath.
Right, you don't
Without
want to have
moving
any.
your fingers
You're right.
over.
You don't want any handprints. You don't want any thumbprints. See where I've got that there? You can see I might have had a thumbprint involved, but we can smooth that out by just taking your palms of your hands and rubbing it in. You want to really pressing these folds into the wall, and that's what's going to create the textured effect underneath the plastic.
Okay. Well, time for the next one.
Yep. Once you get those in place, grab another piece of plastic.
All right. There you go. And this can just lap down over the base now,
Right. Just go ahead and overlap on the plastic we had before.
And the reason we don't take the first piece off first is we'll screw up what's underneath this when we put the second piece on. again, I would
You'll have
imagine.
some overlap marks, so
Yeah.
it's best to leave the plastic on the wall until you're complete with the finish.
And I suppose working this base in is fairly crucial.
Get it all the way down in there. Use your fingertips to do so.
This is a fairly simple type of finish to put on, I would think.
This is very easy and it goes very quickly, but it's very effective in the end as well.
All right. Is that about it?
That looks good.
So we pull this one
Reveal
off.
our...
Now we just throw the plastic away.
Once you're finished and you want to move on to a new section, you throw this away and start with a fresh piece.
Oh, that looks great. And the top one? Oh, yeah, what a unique look.
Is that different?
That is fantastic.
It's a pretty unique look.
Now, while Carrie and I were smushing that last wall, Kelly was setting up a crackle finish demonstration on a sample board. There's a few systems out there now at the home centers and paint stores, but his first step was to cover the base color on the board with a special sizing that seals the surface. After letting that set up, he then spread a white crackling medium over that. Now this is a special formula too, and it'll vary with the system you employ. Now the full effect takes about an hour, so we're using some time-lapse video to show you the transformation. The crackling medium slowly contracts as it dries, and the base color gradually peeks through. When you're done, you've got the look of old cracking paint. Again, the steps and materials may vary with the system you choose, so be sure to follow the directions for the best finish. Okay, just keep the old slide sponge going like so, right?
You got it.
This is looking about right?
Yep, that's what we want.
Now, the last technique we're going to be doing with Kelly and Carrie is something I think people feel is a lot more involved than it really is, and that's a marbleizing technique. Now, we're going to be using it with two different colored glazes. I'm laying down the first one right now, and I would say, Kelly, that's probably enough for you to jump in there and start
I think I'll
your
go ahead.
magic, right?
Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in first off and I'm just going to model this finish down with some rags. Just blend it down, just kind of flounce it out.
And the technique here is to have some lighter spots, but then keep some fairly dark ones.
Yes.
Keep it real mottled looking.
We want to just keep working our glaze first and get our area worked out. At the same time I'm doing this, you're keeping the wet edge on that other side.
Keeping my belly going over here, not too straight an edge. Now, this is definitely a technique that you would probably want one person to do. You don't want to have two different styles showing up, right?
Absolutely. It's better for one person to do one thing and the other person to do another one for teamwork. Now I'm going to come in and just in a 45-degree direction, I'm just going to take some excess glaze off, exposing more of the background color, just randomly here and there. There's no method to this, and you don't really want to just think about it. You just kind of go and bring that background color off.
But at the same time, there is a little bit of a style. You have to create some open areas and then have some other. You don't want to have it be too uniform throughout the.
Exactly. Because the uniformity, actually, this is more of a random finish, so you can just kind of go at any rate, and you just can start to see our marble pattern flowing in more of a 45-degree direction here.
Kind of how the stone comes out of the ground. It's just sliding down like that.
Now a cleaner rag, you might come in and it'll take more of that off so we can come back into some of these areas and take some more off.
Okay. All right, and then once you reach this point.
Then what we're going to do is I'm going to come in with a feather. This is just a regular goose or turkey feather.
All right.
I'm going to take this feather and I'm going to dip it back in my glaze.
So it isn't a bald eagle feather there, is it?
Get a little excess glaze on there. And I'm just going to come in here and there just randomly and create some veins just any place here and there.
Now this is where I think people really feel the artistry comes in.
I don't think it's that difficult really. You're just getting your glaze on your feather and just kind of pulling some veins through there anywhere you want, just randomly. I'm going to go ahead and let you try it, Dean.
Take a whack.
Right, dip your feather again.
Okay.
And
You always work with a wet feather, right? Okay. And it probably helps to have some fairly dark veins.
absolutely.
Than some light ones.
Some darker and lighter veins, absolutely. They help the pattern to get...
Don't space them too evenly, I suppose.
Nope, just real random.
Okay.
Then you could come back in with a sponge lightly or your rag and just softly dab some of the heavier ones out like so.
So maybe get one more over here. Okay, so
perfect.
Enough for veins, maybe?
Perfect. Now what we're going to do is have Carrie come in, and she's going to do a second color glaze process.
Okay.
Using a lighter color glaze, and just randomly place a color.
So this is the second color that we're putting on top then. All right, so what's the technique here? No sliding, I notice. It's pretty much just dabbing.
Yeah, this is something we just want to apply on top of the other colors, giving it some more layering effect. And where your veins maybe are a little darker in areas, I can come in and blend them a little more, tone them down. This just adds another layer of dimension and more realism to
Like
your marble.
this vein up here is fairly dark. That might be something you
Yeah.
just
If we wanted to
tone
block
down.
that down a bit, we could just kind of tap in there and
ever so slightly.
just kind of blend it. You don't want to smudge or anything. You just want to kind of dab it and pat it
Okay.
and give it some uniform.
Well, I have to tell you, this looks great. And this is the one that I think people think, oh boy, it's just impossible to create. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for helping us out. I think we've given everybody really a nice variety of faux finishes to work into their house, so I appreciate you coming up.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
I suppose we got to wrap up the rest of this wall here before it gets too dry. Now, you can also put a clear coat over the top of this, can't you?
Yeah, we could use a gloss finish over the top to give it that marble realism, or we could just use it for a durable top coat.
Just as
Carrie also joined us on another project for 3 more techniques, starting with one known as a buried stencil. Here's how that works.
Okay, so we have, looks like most of the glaze is mixed. What's involved in that operation?
Well, in the glaze mixtures, the old rule of thumb, or the typical rule of thumb, is 4 parts glaze to 1 part latex paint. I've modified that for this finish that we're doing today because I need my colors to be a little stronger and bolder. So I'm going to use about 50% glaze and about 50% latex paint.
Okay.
That gives me stronger colors.
Now, why use glaze? Why not just use paint on the wall?
Glazing liquid gives me some transparency, and it also gives me working time. It keeps the paint from drying out, and it gives you a lot nicer effect.
Okay, so it looks like you have about 7 or 8 colors here. Should I help you haul those over?
That'd be great.
All set to go. I would imagine you want them all over by the wall you're working on, right?
Yes.
The drop cloth into position there. What color are you going to start with first?
I'm going to start with the burgundy and the green colors because they're my most dominant.
Okay. All right. So what's the technique for putting this stuff on?
This is a very random finish. We're going to just brush some colors, kind of strategically place our color, distribute it evenly. It's a very random. We're going to brush it on. We're going to get our greens and our burgundies put on here and there.
Okay.
And you don't have to worry about dipping your brush in the same color because the colors are blending together on the wall anyhow.
Yeah, I noticed that you are using the same brush, but what's the point in trying to separate them out because you're blending them all together anyway?
Right. And I might come in with a little cheesecloth and remove some of the glaze in places to make it a little lighter. I want some of that base color to be exposed and come through. And
Okay, do you keep putting your sample board up here to make certain you're maintaining a certain look as you're going?
Yeah, you want to refer back to your sample at all times. Keep making sure you're going in the right direction, that you're getting the right distribution of color, and that you're getting the right level of depth.
Okay, one thing I noticed here, this is a really intense, there's a lot of color on here, whereas what I'm seeing here right now, it's right along the same color line and stuff, but it's fairly transparent.
It's much lighter in places right now because this procedure is all about layering. We're going to
Okay.
do this in layers, and it takes multiple layers to get it to that level of depth that we're after.
Mind if I try it a little bit?
I'd love for you to help.
So if worse comes to worse, you can just go right over the top of what I'm going to do, right?
Right, it's all about layering, so
So I'll
it's
start
not
with
something we can mess up much. And you want to use your brush and put some pressure on it and drag some of that color through and maybe give it a little bit of roll of your brush. You don't want it all up and down. We want some random pattern in there too.
So is this the point where you usually don't like to see your clients come in? They freak out a little bit?
Your client's going to come home and wonder what you're doing to their walls, but you got to remind them that this is just the first layer, and we've got multiple layers to go. And we're going to do some blending and shading in our next step.
Well, we've moved on to the next couple of steps. It's taken us a fair amount of time to get to this point. I have to tell you, this isn't the type of finish you can cover tons of square footage in a short amount of time. There were points where all 3 of us were working on the walls. But with this layered effect, we discovered that as long as Carrie was the last one to come through an area, she could even out any differences between what Robin and I were doing. Now, once all the colors have dried, then we can move on to the next step, which is blending. To do this, we're using kind of a light toffee color. Actually, elk tan is what the manufacturer calls it. And what I'm doing here is just brushing it on lightly and then wiping it off with a little bit of cheesecloth. The paint that we're using here is actually blended to 1 part paint, 4 parts glazing liquid, so it's a little bit thinner going on. The idea is to just knock down the overall colors of the first colors we put on to approximate a little bit closer our sample board. You can see we're getting fairly close now. And this is drying fast enough, so the next step is to move on to the stenciling.
This part seems to be going pretty fast.
Yeah, the stenciling goes real quick. This is the easy part. What I'm doing here is just kind of pouncing in on the glaze that I have mostly paint and some glaze for a little bit of translucency.
Okay.
And I'm going to randomly place these around the room, and they're in 3 different designs.
Okay. About how many do you think would go on a wall like this?
I'm guessing around 9. It's real good to work in odd numbers,
It
better
is.
than even, yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, we've got one more coat, and we're done in this room. So can I give this a shot?
Yeah, I'd like you to try.
Okay. Let's see. We're on to the final step, which is putting a little glaze over the top of everything, including the stencil. This wall is done over here, so you can see where it kind of hides some of the stencil a little bit and continues to blend everything out. So, Carrie, any special tips on this last step?
Well, the tips I would recommend are, well, I'm using a sponge this time,
Okay.
and I'm dipping it in the glaze that we used to give the little blending effect earlier. And when you put it on over the stencil, don't give 100% coverage. Leave it, real random. Leave it darker in places. And each stencil should be a little different. You want them inconsistent and random.
Okay, great. Thank you. Got some darker areas over there. The faux finish that we're doing now starts off looking a bit more like your typical faux finish effect. We put a base coat on the wall, and a lot of that color will be visible in the end process. Right now we're just putting 2 colored glazes on with brushes. The mixture is 1 part latex paint and 4 parts latex glazing liquid. The glazing liquid makes the paint more translucent, and it keeps it from drying quicker, so we have a little bit more time to work our stuff here. This is a point where the technique becomes real important. So Carrie, what are you working towards at this stage of the process?
What we're working for is, for the way you're brushing on your glaze, we just want to get a nice mottled effect, or a nice even distribution of your glaze. I'm going to come in with some cheesecloth and just kind of soften this out a little bit.
Okay.
Not removing too much glaze, but removing enough to make it a nice look. Now this looks kind of like, just your basic
Faux finish.
parchment faux finish effect.
Yeah, but it gets real interesting from this point on, right?
Yes, this is when it gets really unique. What I'm going to do next is come in, and I have denatured alcohol here.
All right.
And I'm just going to dip my fingers in here, get a little alcohol on my fingers, and just start spritzing it on the wall. You're not really going to know where you've got it. You can see the wet, when you first put it on, but just spritz it randomly, not too heavily, but yet not too sparse either, because some of it will dry out and it won't work for us. But you want to just spritz it on there. And we're going to let that set up a little bit, and once it sets up and becomes tacky, we're going to come back and dry brush over it, and you'll begin to see some dimension in your wall. You're going to see little pits. And this area back here, I think, is ready to do some dry brushing to kind of bring some of those pits out. This is a finish you do have to worry about your drying time, and you want to keep a wet edge when you go forward.
I noticed this is going a lot quicker than the walls in the dining room.
Yeah,
were,
this is a lot quicker and a little bit less labor intensive.
So
There's
you
a lot of
gotta
steps.
keep this moving.
Keep it moving right along.
All right. Well, I'll keep brushing on here then. Like we said before, on the upper half of this wall, we really had to keep moving. Once we got going, it went by real fast. It took Carrie and I about an hour to do all of this. Well, actually, it was mostly Carrie. But now that it's all dry, you can see where the alcohol hit. It created these little pits and ridges, almost a three-dimensional effect, even though it's an all flat surface. Now we're ready to get started on the effect for the lower half of the wall. And when we're all done, it should end up looking something like this. We're calling it the crocodile effect.
We've mixed up a bucket of material we're going to be using for the texture. Now this involves about 3 gallons of lightweight joint compound and then a tube of caulk. Caulk without silicone. That's very important. And then we use Carrie's secret ingredient, which is liquid detergent. She likes using this brand because evidently it doesn't bubble quite as much. And so now the trick is you just want to trowel this on, a nice thin coat, and then put the cheesecloth over the top of that, right?
Right. I want a thin layer put on just to get the cheesecloth to adhere. And once I get that in place, I'm going to put another layer on anyhow.
I notice your trowel isn't real pointed on the edges, kind of a little bit round. What's the reason for that?
It is a rounded edge trowel. It's nice and handy, but any trowel would work. You just have to be careful that the corners don't snag on the cheesecloth and pull it off for you.
Now, why the caulk in the ingredients here?
The caulk gives the drywall compound a little more durability. And the detergent that we added to it, that gives us a little more spreadability, and it makes it easier for us to maneuver and smooth around.
When you take the cheesecloth, are all those created equal?
Not all cheesecloths are created equal. They're all made different, and they're available in many places. The particular kind that I'm using here is loosely woven. It's got a lot of give to it so that the squares will be different. It won't be the same consistency throughout the finish, which gives it a more unique, creative effect.
I notice, some of the areas are overlapping a little bit, so you aren't real concerned about having it nice and flat and perfect.
You want it to be random, and you don't want your cheesecloth to be perfectly held up in squares. The more folds you get, and the more definition and more interesting effect you'll have.
Okay.
You just want to make sure you trowel this on fairly thick afterwards and spread it on fairly even.
Do you ever work with more than one piece of cheesecloth, or just work with a one piece?
I usually just do one piece at a time.
And is all this cheesecloth created equal, or are there different types?
There's a lot of different types on the market, and this particular cheesecloth I'm using is a real loose weave to it. And it stretches and it gives you a lot of neat different sizes, so it's not perfect. It's got a little more creativity to the effect in the end.
Okay. So once you get all of this troweled out, do you let it sit for a while, or do you just immediately just peel this right back off?
I'm going to peel this off now and reveal what we've just created.
Okay.
We're trying to simulate a crocodile effect.
Oh, yeah, look at that. Now, will you ever knock down any of this texture, or do you just leave it exactly like that?
If you wanted to, you could knock it down in places, but when you do your next piece, that'll create a little bit of smoothing back into it, and that'll give us a lot more interesting, veins and things going on in there.
So we let this set up overnight. Once the entire wall is done, once it's dry, we come back for the next steps tomorrow.
Exactly.
Okay. Once we finished the first stage, we let the joint compound dry overnight, and then we rolled on a coat of paint. This was straight wall paint in a satin finish with no glaze mixed in. It took a pretty thick roller cover and some elbow grease to make sure that the paint got into all the little cracks and creases in the texture. After that was dry, we came back and put a layer of glaze on. The glaze was pretty thin, a 1-part paint to 4 parts glaze mix. We brushed it on to completely cover an area and to get all the way into the texture. Once we had an area covered, we patted it down with a rag to take some of the glaze back off. Now, it's pretty important to pat with a rag. Don't wipe it. The dark glaze tends to collect in the deeper parts of the texture, but you want to make sure that you leave a little glaze on the surface too.
We helped a couple of homeowners, Grant and Jana, redo their lower level, and Carrie showed them how to do a different kind of faux finish, one that goes on a lot thicker than you might expect.
It's kind of a unique product you're using. This is kind of between sort of painting and plastering, isn't it?
Right. It's just kind of like smearing some thick-bodied paint all over the wall. And
a little bit like pudding. If you can look inside here, this is the way it comes right out of the can. And really, pudding is the exact consistency. It kind of looks like a butterscotch pudding, this color, going bad a little bit. But it's attractive color on the wall,
I think it looks
line.
better on the wall than it would taste, Dean, but...
So now this is what, a 3-step process you were saying?
Yeah, we can do it in 3 steps, but it also can be done in multiple layers if you'd like to go 5 steps or more. But the first layer we're doing is just a thin skim coat. We want to trowel it on, just kind of real random, thin, not exposing too much of the base color, but not getting on too thick. You want to make it real spontaneous, highs and lows, and then you'll see it all come together on the second layer.
Okay,
when you fill it in.
The next 2 layers happen the next couple of days here then.
Right.
We don't do any of that today yet.
Nope, we got to let this dry, and then
Okay.
we're going to do the second layer, and then we do some burnishing on top of it as well.
And you had mentioned the nice thing about this, last time you were here to full finish, is saying it was very important to have one person do the entire area because it looks very unique when somebody else jumps in and does a different style. Here, this isn't so much style dependent. You can have 3 different people working on the same wall.
Right, that's the magic of it. It's kind of a treat for us faux finishers to be able to do something and walk away from it without worrying about a dry edge. And we could see how Grant's doing to see if he's catching on to our technique.
I was going to say, even having said that, why don't we just check to see how Grant's doing to make sure it's looking somewhat close to this.
We better make sure you're doing it right.
Grant, how's it coming over here?
Real good. This is a challenge at first, but I think I'm starting to get the hang of it.
Well, so much, I guess, for the theory anybody can do it. Huh?
What do you think, Carrie?
No, actually, this looks pretty good.
I think you did pretty good. It looks to me like maybe down here you can see where he left it a lot more of the white or the base color coming through. Maybe he didn't trowel it on as heavy. And it seems to me, since he switched tools, we've got him using a rounded edge trowel versus the knife.
This worked a lot better. This is a lot more stiff for me anyway. It might be comfortable for somebody else, but this one's a little more light. It doesn't take as much off. So yeah, I've noticed a real difference between using the two with the rounded corners. It's working really well.
A little easier to manipulate it.
Yeah.
So now, Grant, you realize Carrie's only here for a couple days. So
I know.
You have some reinforcements coming in to get this 600 square feet done?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to incorporate Jana into this. I'm sure she can do this.
How about the kids?
They're going to try it. Yep, we'll give it an
artistic bent in either one of those.
We're going to find out. Maybe they can go into the faux finishing business for themselves. We'll find out.
Okay.
They can come work for me if they do a good job.
Well, we're off to a good start, guys. I'm going to keep working on this panel over here.
See if I want to fix those spots, though, I can just come in.
Mm-hmm, it does.
So, Grant, how did it go last night?
I think it went pretty well. The second coat seems to be going on a lot easier than the first coat. I should say faster. It's just a matter of filling in the spots, and as it's drying, it changes color and things. So hopefully, I think we did a good job.
You had quite a few people helping out last night, though, didn't you?
Yeah, we had a few of the neighbors and their wives came over, and everybody, Carrie gave them a good lesson on it, and we were here till 10:30, so had some pizza, and it was a good time, and everybody participated, and it went well.
So, Carrie, how's things looking here? What? Any comments on how the second coat's coming?
Hey, let me take a peek at this. Looks good. Grant's a good apprentice.
Good teacher.
You're doing real good, actually. You can see where he's troweling over this. It leaves the detail kind of pops through, and it's not a matter of putting it on real thin or real thick. You just want to get a pretty much 100% coverage over the first layer, like he's done, and that makes the really cool texture pop out. And then when you burnish over this, that even shows up nicer.
You don't want to leave it too profiled on the top of the wall, though, do you?
It gets a little bumpy, and if you don't like that look, you can trowel it on a little heavier and fill in some of that gap so it's a little smoother.
But you're saying if you like that look, go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just leave it a little bit more ready.
Yeah, if you like the texture, use it.
You definitely want to cover up all the drywall that's showing through, though.
Yeah,
right?
you don't want any of that white base color popping through. You want to give a good coverage over that.
Okay.
But it looks like you and your crew did good.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carrie.
Now, one problem I heard they had was with that many people working, every now and again the paint was dropping on the drop cloths, and people walk over the drop cloths, start tracking it on the carpet. And
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was inevitable, like I say, just because of the people. But, if you pay attention to it, and like I said, we got it up right away, and with a little bit of water and a little bit of carpet cleaner, and it came up pretty well. Jana came down this morning and saw a few spots, and that's what I was doing. But
I noticed that's the first thing I saw this morning was you on your hands and knees taking care of carpet.
It came out quite well. I just have to be aware of it, that's all.
Okay. Well, Carrie, let's talk a little bit about that third coat. Or not the third coat, but what do you call it? Burnishing?
Yeah, it's the third step, the third
step.
process in the finish.
So, Carrie, this part is already burnished right here, right? Just feels a little smoother?
Right. That's where I've done some burnishing, and you can see the difference here versus up here where we haven't. It's kind of dull, not a lot of texture sticking through, but...
And a little ruddier, just kind of
right.
plain.
This just brings a really nice polish effect, and it makes that first layer that we troweled on pop through the second layer and gives you a really neat look, and from a distance you'll notice that detail a little more too.
Well, it just kind of raises these dark spots and gives it a little bit more depth, it seems like. Now, of course, we've been working just one color on top of the same color. You could use different colors as well, right?
Right? You could do a combination of colors and layer those. It seems to be a little busier, a little more patchy that way.
Yeah,
but
I suppose a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, if that's the look you're going for, though, it could work.
And then there's nothing saying you only have to use 2 coats. You could do several.
Right, and I find the more layers you trowel, the better, because you get a more in-depth finish. You've got multiple layers. It's all the same color. It's still monochromatic, but it really draws depth that way.
I'll tell you, this is a lot of work, though. You have to press pretty hard to get this
It is a
done.
workout. You will get a workout by the time you're done with a big area like we've got going here.
So you think Grant and Gina are ready to wrap up this whole project, do the bedrooms and the bathroom?
I know they are. They've got this down pat, and they've even got the neighborhood involved, and they're going to have an awesome finished basement when they're done.
Okay, say one thing you should show the audience the blisters you've raised here over the past couple of days. That's one thing a little troweling will do for you, huh?
No one said faux finishing was easy. We earn our keep.
I'll tell you, we appreciate very much what you've done. You can come back and raise blisters with us any point in time, all right?
Anytime,
So
Dean.
thanks so much.
Thanks.
It's pretty amazing what those faux finishers can do. But for this last technique, I'm just using a simple feather duster. You just dip it into the glaze, offload some of that paint so it's not so heavy on the wall. Well, that should do it. And then just start dabbing, twisting your wrist, working a small area at a time. And really, the spacing is just up to you to create whatever kind of effect that you want. Now, these feathers do tend to gum up after a while, so it's nice to have a few extra around. Otherwise, your pattern will change as you move down the wall. Plus, they are only a couple bucks a piece. Well, we didn't cover every faux finish or look or tool available, but hopefully we gave you enough to get you started. Just remember, have enough sample boards available to practice on. And if you do mess up on the wall, don't worry about it. Just paint over it and start again. See you next time. Thanks for watching.